Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
Long before Christopher Columbus set sail across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492, the Caribbean was already a vibrant tapestry of cultures, traditions, and people. The official narrative of history often begins with Columbus discovering the New World, as if it were a blank slate waiting to be inscribed. Yet, beneath the waves of the Caribbean Sea and upon the lush islands dotting its expanse, echoes of an ancient and largely untold story linger, one that challenges conventional accounts and asks provocative questions about who truly inhabited these lands before the arrival of European explorers. Among the most compelling and controversial questions concerns the presence of black-skinned peoples in the Caribbean prior to Columbus. Could it be possible that African-descended populations reached the Americas centuries, or even millennia, before the voyages of the Spanish? And if so, what evidence exists to substantiate these claims? This question does not merely invite speculation but offers an opportunity to reimagine the history of the Americas through a broader and more inclusive lens. Our exploration begins in an era shrouded in mystery. Imagine the Caribbean islands as they were before European contact. Verdant jungles alive with the hum of cicadas, turquoise waters teeming with life, and thriving human communities cultivating the land and trading with neighboring regions. Into this setting, a bold hypothesis emerges that black-skinned peoples, potentially of African origin, played a formative role in shaping the cultural and genetic landscape of the Caribbean. The idea of early transoceanic contact between Africa and the Americas has intrigued historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists for decades. Some point to cultural parallels between ancient African civilizations and indigenous American societies, while others cite oral traditions, linguistic traces, and even skeletal remains as potential evidence of pre-Columbian African presence. Skeptics, on the other hand, dismiss such claims as speculative at best, arguing that no definitive proof links ancient Africans to the pre-Columbian Caribbean. But history, as we know, is often written by the victors. The erasure of certain narratives, whether intentional or incidental, has left us with a fragmented picture of humanity's interconnected past. To uncover the truth about the Caribbean's black-skinned tribes, we must sift through layers of evidence, scrutinize centuries-old records, and honor the oral histories passed down through generations. This is not merely an academic exercise, but a journey into the soul of a region whose history is as complex and multifaceted as the people who inhabit it. Let us embark on this journey with open minds and a willingness to embrace nuance. What follows is an examination of historical, archaeological, and cultural evidence, framed within the broader context of global migrations and the interplay of civilizations. It is a story that challenges Eurocentric paradigms, celebrates human ingenuity, and invites us to reconsider the boundaries of what we thought we knew about the Caribbean and its earliest inhabitants. The story of the Caribbean's early inhabitants is as captivating as it is enigmatic. For centuries, the prevailing narrative has emphasized the arrival of the Arawaks, the Caribs, and other indigenous groups whose rich cultures left a significant mark on the region. Yet, whispers of a pre-Columbian African presence persist, challenging established histories and prompting deeper investigations into the origins of these islands' first inhabitants. To fully explore this possibility, we must first consider the ancient world's navigational and migratory capabilities. Contrary to popular belief, pre-modern societies were not isolated pockets of humanity. They were often interconnected through trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. While European historians long believed that the Atlantic Ocean acted as an impenetrable barrier between continents, emerging evidence suggests otherwise. The Atlantic, vast and daunting, has always been a formidable natural boundary. Yet, civilizations throughout history have demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in overcoming geographic obstacles. African seafaring, in particular, reveals a history of innovation and exploration. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, were accomplished sailors who ventured far beyond the Nile. They built large, seaworthy vessels capable of navigating open waters, trading as far south as modern-day Somalia and as far east as India. Similarly, the West African empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were deeply intertwined with maritime trade networks. During the reign of Mansa Musa in the 14th century, Mali was one of the most powerful and prosperous empires in the world. Oral traditions and historical accounts, such as those of the Arab scholar al-Amari, recount an extraordinary expedition undertaken by Mansa Musa's predecessor, Abu Bakr, who is said to have abdicated his throne to explore the Atlantic Ocean with a fleet of 2,000 ships. While the ultimate fate of this expedition remains unknown, it underscores the adventurous spirit and navigational expertise of West African peoples. Could such voyages have brought African sailors to the shores of the Caribbean? While definitive evidence remains elusive, tantalizing clues suggest the possibility. One of the most intriguing aspects of the pre-Columbian African presence hypothesis lies in the cultural and linguistic parallels between African and indigenous American societies. Certain artifacts discovered in the Americas bear striking similarities to those from ancient African cultures. For instance, terracotta sculptures unearthed in Central and South America share stylistic features with those of the Nok civilization in Nigeria, which flourished from approximately 1000 BCE to 300 CE. Furthermore, some researchers have identified linguistic overlaps between African and indigenous Caribbean languages. Ivan van Sertima, in his groundbreaking work They Came Before Columbus, argued that certain words in Caribbean Arawak languages bore phonetic and semantic similarities to West African languages. While critics have questioned the methodological rigor of these claims, they nonetheless raise compelling questions about ancient cross-cultural exchanges. Archaeology offers another potential avenue for exploring the presence of black-skinned tribes in the Caribbean. Skeletal remains excavated from pre-Columbian sites have occasionally displayed physical characteristics more commonly associated with African populations. For example, cranial morphology studies have identified traits in some remains that align with African phenotypes. While such findings are not definitive proof of African ancestry, they suggest a more complex narrative of human migration and settlement. In addition to skeletal evidence, advancements in genetic research have opened new doors for understanding ancient populations. DNA analysis of indigenous Caribbean remains could potentially reveal traces of African ancestry, shedding light on whether transatlantic contact occurred before Columbus. However, such studies are still in their infancy, and much work remains to be done. Perhaps the most evocative evidence for a pre-Columbian African presence in the Caribbean comes from oral traditions and indigenous accounts. Many indigenous Caribbean groups, including the Taino and Caribs, have stories of encounters with dark-skinned peoples. These accounts often describe the visitors as skilled navigators and traders who arrived in large, seaworthy vessels. While oral histories are sometimes dismissed as myth or folklore, they are invaluable repositories of cultural memory. By examining these stories with care and respect, we can gain insights into the lived experiences of the region's early inhabitants. Geography and ocean currents further support the plausibility of transatlantic contact. The Atlantic Ocean is not a static expanse but a dynamic system shaped by powerful currents. The Canary Current, which flows southwestward from the coast of North Africa, and the North Equatorial Current, which moves westward toward the Americas, create natural pathways that could have facilitated ancient maritime travel. Historical records show that even accidental voyages across the Atlantic were possible. For instance, in the 15th and 16th centuries, European sailors documented finding African canoes adrift in the Atlantic, some carrying goods and passengers. If such journeys occurred during the age of exploration, there is little reason to doubt they could have happened centuries earlier. Interestingly, even Columbus himself noted the presence of black-skinned peoples in the Americas. In his journals, he recorded interactions with indigenous groups who spoke of trading with black men who had arrived from the south and east. These accounts, though often overlooked, provide intriguing evidence that Africans may have reached the Americas long before Europeans. Despite the compelling nature of these clues, the idea of a pre-Columbian African presence in the Caribbean remains a subject of intense debate. Critics argue that much of the evidence is circumstantial, and that the lack of direct archaeological proof undermines the hypothesis. Others contend that the theory risks overshadowing the achievements of indigenous Caribbean peoples by attributing their innovations to external influences. However, these critiques need not diminish the importance of investigating the possibility of African contact. History is rarely neat or linear, and the interconnectedness of human societies often defies simplistic explanations. By acknowledging the complexity of the past, we can honor both the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and the potential contributions of African voyagers. The notion of a pre-Columbian African presence in the Caribbean extends beyond archaeology, anthropology, and oral traditions. It challenges us to rethink the very foundations of how we interpret human history. This challenge is not only about uncovering forgotten narratives, but also addressing the biases inherent in the traditional telling of history. The story of ancient peoples, their movements, and their achievements has often been filtered through a Eurocentric lens, marginalizing non-European contributions to global civilization. To delve deeper, let us explore additional layers of evidence and speculation surrounding this captivating question. Through maritime ingenuity, artistic and symbolic parallels, and new scientific approaches, we might uncover a more nuanced understanding of the Caribbean's early history. The capability of ancient African civilizations to undertake transoceanic voyages is a cornerstone of the hypothesis that black-skinned tribes might have reached the Caribbean before Columbus. While critics argue that such journeys would have been improbable due to the vastness of the Atlantic, history tells a different story about humanity's enduring relationship with the sea. The Phoenicians, for example, were ancient mariners from the eastern Mediterranean who navigated the coasts of Africa as early as the first millennium BCE. Egyptian sailors voyaged far along the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, and there are accounts of ships traveling from Punt, likely located in the Horn of Africa or southern Arabia, to the Nile Valley. These precedents suggest that ancient seafaring technology was far more advanced than often assumed. West Africa's proximity to the Atlantic is significant. With the Canary Islands and Cape Verde archipelago lying relatively close to the mainland, ancient sailors could have used these islands as waypoints for longer journeys westward. Moreover, the natural currents of the Atlantic, such as the Canary and North Equatorial currents, could have acted as highways, making transoceanic travel feasible for skilled navigators. Artifacts such as ancient depictions of ships, navigational tools, and accounts of African maritime practices provide indirect evidence supporting this hypothesis. For instance, the Mali Empire's oral history describing Abu Bakr's transatlantic expedition raises compelling questions about the ambitions and capabilities of African rulers during the medieval period. Symbols and artistic motifs shared between African and pre-Columbian societies present another intriguing line of inquiry. The Olmec civilization of Mesoamerica, often regarded as the mother culture of the Americas, has been a focal point for such discussions. Scholars have noted that some Olmec sculptures, particularly the colossal basalt heads, feature facial features that bear a resemblance to those of African populations. These statues, with their broad noses and full lips, have sparked debate about whether they reflect African influence or are purely coincidental representations of local peoples. Critics argue that attributing these features to African influence risks imposing external explanations onto indigenous cultures. However, proponents of the African contact theory suggest that these sculptures may represent a shared cultural memory of interactions between African voyagers and the peoples of Mesoamerica, who may have transmitted their artistic styles and techniques to the Caribbean islands. Beyond the Olmec heads, parallels in pottery styles, textile patterns, and symbolic representations in rock art have been cited as evidence of cross-cultural exchange. While these connections remain speculative, they point to the need for further research into the global diffusion of artistic and symbolic traditions. In recent years, advances in genetic research have provided powerful tools for tracing human migrations. By analyzing the genetic makeup of present-day populations, scientists can uncover historical connections that were previously invisible. Applying these methods to the Caribbean and West African populations has the potential to shed light on whether ancient Africans contributed to the gene pool of the region before the arrival of Europeans. Mitochondrial DNA, which is passed down from mothers to their offspring, is particularly useful for tracing maternal lineages. Similarly, Y chromosome analysis can reveal paternal ancestry. While studies of indigenous Caribbean remains are still limited, future research could reveal genetic markers linking ancient Caribbean populations to Africa. Such findings would offer direct evidence of African presence in the region, lending weight to the hypothesis of pre-Columbian contact. One fascinating case involves the discovery of certain genetic markers among modern populations in the Caribbean that are more closely associated with African groups than with indigenous American or European lineages. While these markers are often attributed to the transatlantic slave trade, it is worth considering whether some may have predated European colonization. Mythology and oral histories often serve as conduits for preserving historical memory. In many African cultures, griots, traditional storytellers, play a vital role in recounting the past. Similarly, indigenous Caribbean groups have maintained oral traditions that speak of mysterious visitors who arrived on their shores long before European contact. These stories often describe dark-skinned people who came from the East, bringing new technologies, knowledge, and goods. While skeptics might dismiss such accounts as folklore, oral histories frequently contain kernels of truth, particularly when they align with other lines of evidence. For instance, indigenous myths about celestial navigation and oceanic voyages could suggest a shared understanding of maritime practices with African cultures. Another angle worth exploring is the potential ecological impact of African arrivals in the Caribbean. Human migrations often leave behind environmental traces, such as the introduction of new plant and animal species. If Africans reached the Caribbean before Columbus, they may have brought crops, livestock, or other ecological markers with them. Yams, for example, are a staple crop in West Africa and are also found in parts of the Caribbean. While it is generally believed that yams were introduced to the Americas during the transatlantic slave trade, the possibility of earlier introductions cannot be ruled out. Similarly, certain banana species and other tropical plants found in the Americas have origins in Africa and Southeast Asia, raising questions about how and when they were introduced. Examining pollen records, sediment layers, and other environmental data from pre-Columbian archaeological sites could provide clues about ancient agricultural practices and the movement of crops across continents. One of the greatest challenges in exploring the possibility of pre-Columbian African presence in the Caribbean is overcoming the biases of historical scholarship. For centuries, Eurocentric narratives have dominated the study of history, often dismissing non-European achievements as insignificant or irrelevant. The idea of Africans reaching the Americas before Columbus disrupts these narratives by suggesting that global interconnectedness and cultural exchange were far more complex than traditionally acknowledged. Recognizing the contributions of African civilizations to the broader human story is not merely a matter of correcting historical inaccuracies. It is an act of justice that honors the resilience and ingenuity of marginalized peoples. To fully understand the possibility of black-skinned tribes in the Caribbean before Columbus, we must adopt a multidisciplinary approach. The intersection of archaeology, anthropology, genetics, linguistics, and even climatology provides a richer, more layered understanding of history. Each discipline contributes a unique lens through which to view the past, and together, they create a mosaic of possibilities. Anthropological studies, for example, focus on cultural exchanges and the transmission of ideas, technologies, and traditions. They reveal the interconnectedness of ancient societies, even across vast distances. Meanwhile, archaeological evidence provides tangible links to these connections, as artifacts and ruins stand as silent witnesses to past interactions. Genetic studies, though still in their infancy regarding pre-Columbian populations, offer groundbreaking potential to trace human migrations across continents and oceans. Climatology adds another intriguing dimension. By studying historical climate patterns, scientists can reconstruct the environmental conditions that ancient mariners would have faced. Favorable winds and currents, for example, could have facilitated transatlantic voyages, while adverse conditions might explain the timing and routes of human migrations. These diverse fields of study collectively challenge us to reconsider the boundaries of ancient exploration. If black-skinned tribes reached the Caribbean before Columbus, their arrival would have been accompanied by a wealth of knowledge and cultural traditions. African civilizations were renowned for their expertise in astronomy, agriculture, and metallurgy, skills that would have significantly influenced the societies they encountered. Astronomy, in particular, played a crucial role in navigation for many ancient cultures. African civilizations such as the Dogon of Mali and the ancient Egyptians developed sophisticated astronomical systems, mapping the stars and understanding celestial cycles. This knowledge may have been instrumental in guiding transatlantic voyages. The ability to navigate by the stars, combined with an understanding of ocean currents and weather patterns, could have enabled African mariners to traverse the Atlantic with remarkable accuracy. Agricultural practices also highlight the potential influence of African migrants in the Caribbean. Techniques such as crop rotation, irrigation, and the cultivation of drought-resistant plants were well established in Africa and could have been shared with indigenous Caribbean populations. This exchange of agricultural knowledge might have contributed to the flourishing of pre-Columbian societies in the region. Historical records and early European accounts offer tantalizing glimpses into the possibility of African presence in the Caribbean before Columbus. Some early explorers, including Christopher Columbus himself, reported encounters with dark-skinned peoples in the Americas who did not appear to belong to the indigenous populations. These descriptions, though often vague and filtered through the biases of the time, provide intriguing hints of a more complex pre-Columbian world. One of the most cited accounts is that of the Spanish historian Bartolomé de las Casas, who documented the presence of black-skinned individuals in the Caribbean shortly after the arrival of Europeans. Las Casas described these individuals as distinct from African slaves brought by the Europeans, raising the possibility that they were part of a pre-existing population. Another notable source is the accounts of Arab historians and geographers, such as Al-Idrisi and Ibn Battuta, who documented African maritime traditions and trade networks extending across the Atlantic. These records, though often overlooked in Western scholarship, provide valuable insights into the capabilities and ambitions of African civilizations. If African voyagers reached the Caribbean, their interactions with indigenous populations would have resulted in cultural hybridization. This process, in which two or more cultures blend to create new traditions and practices, is a hallmark of human history. Evidence of such interactions might be found in language, religion, art, and social structures. Linguistic studies, for example, can reveal shared roots between African and indigenous Caribbean languages. Certain words, phrases, and grammatical structures may point to historical exchanges, even if these connections are subtle or fragmentary. Similarly, religious practices and spiritual beliefs might bear traces of African influence, particularly in rituals, symbols, and cosmologies. Artistic traditions, too, provide a rich field for exploration. The integration of African and indigenous motifs in pottery, textiles, and sculpture could offer clues about the extent and nature of these interactions. Such artifacts, though often open to interpretation, serve as tangible evidence of cultural exchange. Despite mounting evidence and growing scholarly interest, the idea of pre-Columbian African presence in the Caribbean faces significant resistance. This resistance stems from a combination of factors, including entrenched Eurocentric biases, the lack of definitive archaeological proof, and the broader challenges of rewriting established historical narratives. Eurocentric historiography has long minimized or dismissed the achievements of non-European civilizations. The idea that Africans could have independently reached the Americas before Columbus disrupts traditional narratives of European superiority and innovation. As a result, such theories are often marginalized or labeled as fringe. The lack of definitive archaeological evidence further complicates the case for pre-Columbian African presence. While there are tantalizing clues, such as ancient artifacts and skeletal remains, these findings are often subject to debate and reinterpretation. The absence of conclusive proof leaves room for skepticism, even among open-minded scholars. The possibility of black-skinned tribes in the Caribbean before Columbus invites us to reimagine the human story as one of interconnectedness rather than isolation. It challenges us to move beyond the traditional boundaries of continents and cultures, recognizing that human exploration and ingenuity have always transcended geographic and social barriers. This reimagining is not merely an academic exercise. It has profound implications for how we understand our shared history. By acknowledging the contributions of African civilizations to the pre-Columbian Americas, we honor the resilience and creativity of humanity as a whole. We also confront the biases and limitations of historical scholarship, paving the way for a more inclusive and accurate understanding of the past. The question of whether black-skinned tribes inhabited the Caribbean before Columbus remains a subject of fascination and debate. While definitive proof may elude us, the convergence of archaeological, genetic, linguistic, and cultural evidence suggests that the idea is far from implausible. Ancient African mariners, driven by curiosity and ingenuity, may well have played a role in shaping the history of the Caribbean long before the arrival of Europeans. As we continue to uncover new evidence and challenge established narratives, we are reminded that history is not a static record but a dynamic and evolving field of inquiry. By embracing a more inclusive and multidisciplinary approach, we not only uncover forgotten stories, but also celebrate the diversity and interconnectedness of the human experience. The legacy of ancient explorers, whether African, indigenous, or otherwise, reminds us that the boundaries we perceive today are not reflections of the past but constructs of the present. The Caribbean, with its vibrant tapestry of cultures and histories, stands as a testament to the enduring spirit of exploration and exchange, a spirit that unites us all in the shared journey of humanity.